What's up, guys? It's Rowan
and Brooklyn
here from Artismart TV, bringing you another episode of the HSC English Lit Program, otherwise known as
#help.
Now, one of the things that we find is that analysing text in English is particularly challenging. In this episode, we're going to be doing a deep dive into a common module text, the text in human experiences, which is All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. I'm probably mispronouncing his name.
I don't know. I would say Doerr.
To be honest, we're going to be mispronouncing a lot of names in this episode. Now, before we dive in and actually teach you and show you how to analyse texts, and specifically analyse All the Light We Cannot See, what we first want to do is just highlight and unpack really quickly two really important principles of analysing texts that we're going to be using in this video. So what are these two formulas or these two critical things we need to pay attention to when we're analysing a text?
Cool. So the first thing that we always like to talk about here is that we want to be linking our technique to our idea. So the big mistake that students often make is that they just label their technique. They just go in and say, this was a metaphor, and then they go straight to the idea of their topic sentence. And they don't actually talk about what that technique is doing. And what good analysis will do is it will sort of think really deeply about why that specific technique is being used and then how the effect of that technique actually then links to the overall idea that they're trying to talk about.
Okay, so is that one or the two principles rolled up into one? I've got
that's
linking.
one. That's the first principle.
Okay, good. Just so everyone's paying attention, we've got linking. What's the second principle?
So I think the second principle sort of flows on from that, right? Because the issue we have when we're sort of trying to link everything back to this idea, right, is that we might end up getting a little bit repetitive if we're sort of, with every single example we're giving, linking back to the exact same topic sentence. So the second principle is the idea that with every point we're making, we want to say something new. We want to build on our argument. It might be the same sort of overall overarching idea, but we want to sort of look at a different facet of it in each point that we make. Does that make sense?
Perfect. So guys, hold us to account. We're going to go through now and actually do an analysis and show you how to do an analysis on All the Light We Cannot See. And let us know in the comments, have we met both of these two key principles of good analysis? Now, before we dive in, just a little bit of context that we need to unpack here for this text. Now, there's a general idea that the victors write history. And we certainly see that, I think, for post-World War II. We've got the Allies, they win, and they really define what the history looks like. And through that, there's, I think, a real myth. We'll argue that emerges that, the West is therefore always good and was always good throughout World War II. And on the flip side, the Nazis were all bad, every single one of them. And I think, of course, there's some good reasons for that contextualization. A big thing called the Holocaust is a really good reason why we view that. But I think what it tends to do is it tends to overall dehumanize German society and many everyday normal people that were caught up themselves in a broader society and broader movements that were in many cases out of their own control. So now what we're now going to do is we're now going to dive in and actually look explicitly at All the Light We Cannot See and actually show you how to analyze by going through and looking at actual examples. Now, before we do that, though, we need to get a bigger picture sense of what our topic sentence is actually going to be. So what are we trying to do here, Brooklyn?
So what we're going to be talking about in this episode and the overall idea that we're going to be linking all our techniques back to is the idea that Anthony Doerr breaks down the dichotomy of victims and perpetrators in World War II, suggesting that we're all human beings who are similarly victims of the whole system of war. So in particular, in this sort of episode / it'll be like a paragraph that we'll post online as well. Doerr is using the character of Werner. I need to remember to say Werner because it's spelled with a W, so call me up on that, either you or you guys in the comments if I say Werner throughout the episode. But yeah, basically, despite him committing horrific, terrible acts as a Nazi, Doerr still presents him as a human being, and he's sort of showing us that sort of no matter who we are, what context we find ourselves in, what side of the war we're in, we're all still human beings.
And I think the context here is that, there's an idea that victors write history. And I think there's certainly a perception in the West that the Allies and the West itself were all good throughout World War II, and the Nazis on the flip side were all evil. And of course, there's some very good reasons for that. The Holocaust is a really powerful example, but I think certainly what it does is it really leads us to dehumanize the entirety of both the German people as well as Nazis specifically, And I think certainly what we're going to see here is that actually there's a whole lot of humanity there, and there's some broader, sort of society, system-wide, impacts that can cause people to do horrible things, and that doesn't still make them not human. So, with that in mind, what's the first sort of example that we're going to really look at here from the text?
Cool, so when Werner is first introduced, we're told that he appears in the kitchen with fresh milk for the babies. So what we've got here is the technique of imagery. We've got this very sort of childlike images of milk, which is obviously quite childlike. We've got babies, and there's a bunch of other techniques from these first few pages, and quotes that you could take as well that are sort of just about how he's such a sweet little orphan boy, basically.
And so this is very much also, I think, quite emotive language, in the sense of it's really trying to get us to feel empathy for Werner, he's an orphan, he doesn't have people to look after him, it already framing this idea of, well, is it surprising maybe that he gets caught up with everything that's going to happen in Nazi Germany, given where he comes from? And so we really do start to, I think, feel more strongly about Werner as a human being, and not so much as, who he might become and what he might do through the course of the war. So then, what's this contrasted to? Because obviously, we've got this imagery of Werner, but Doerr does a really great job of starting to create a contrast. What is that?
So we contrast it to the ever-quickening, ever-expanding machine that was Germany. So I think what we have here is the contrast between sort of that very childlike, innocent images with the more, I guess, dehumanized images of the machine that's Germany.
Yeah, and I think, we've got, just that sort of repetition as well in ever-quickening, ever-expanding. What it creates, I think, for me particularly, is this sense of inevitability. Germany is just, once you turn the machine on, it's going to operate, and it's going to move, and it's going to just catch and take all with it. And I think that particularly then is contrast with Werner, because of the innocence that's portrayed. It's not just innocence, to some extent, it's also helplessness that really starts to come through. And that helplessness then gets, I think, perhaps not dramatized, but certainly exaggerated when you then compare it to this machine that is just growing and expanding that is Germany. And it's like, how could someone not get caught up in that, particularly for Werner's background? So that leads us now to example number 2. So what's the second example we're going to look at here?
Cool, so a little bit later, Werner does get picked up by the Nazis. He joins this little Nazi school. He ends up basically using mathematics to be able to track down radios so that he's able to track down enemies of the Nazis and ultimately kill them, right? So as he's doing this, he's sort of a little bit conflicted about it. He's like, the math that I'm doing is going to kill people. But he sort of just keeps telling himself, it's only numbers, pure math. So that quote, only numbers, pure math, is repeated a few times. So that becomes a recurring motif. So recurring motif is our technique there. So what's that showing us?
So I think, one, it's showing that innocence is now sort of passing, and Werner's becoming more like a machine. I mean, machines in terms of computers themselves operate in zeros and ones. They look at, processing the commands, but not necessarily the outcome that occurs at the end of that. And that's very much how Werner starts to deal with the sort of ethical challenges that he's finding himself in, is to distance himself from the outcome and focus more on the process, which is the zeros and ones, so to speak. And so we see, to some extent, his distancing himself from his own humanity and becoming more like the machine. And potentially we're seeing this as partly a survival mechanism as well.
I think what's really interesting about this recurring motif of the pure math is the idea that, yes, he himself is becoming less like a human because he is sort of thinking in this more mathematical rather than empathetic, emotions, human kind of way. But at the same time, he's also dehumanizing his enemies, right? He's seeing those people that are being killed as numbers.
And he has to, I think.
Yeah, he has to. And I think a big part of what Doerr is saying, he's trying to present his Nazi character as human, but he's also trying to show us that through the characters that we should be seeing others as humans. And when we stop seeing others as humans, that's when we can become...
We start having... atrocities
less human or do evil acts and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. I think it's also interesting just the sort of word choice of pure as well, in the sense that...
It's a very...
Because, of course, right, like there's a sense of, this idea then of still this ongoing innocence, right, that's carried through. And also a way for Werner to feel like what he is doing is pure. It's good. It's actually not evil and bad and so forth. And so I just found that quite interesting as
But
well.
there's, of course, also the connotations of, like, pure as in, like, Aryan race kind of stuff
there's
going
also
on there
that
as well. So,
yes.
And maybe even that's sort of a bit of a comment, might be going down a bit of a rabbit hole here, but maybe that's a bit of a comment on how Nazis sort of justified that sort of idea of the Aryan pure.
That's
pure
right,
blood
as in
thing,
it was for the bigger picture.
It was something that they saw as maybe innocent and pure. I don't know, that's probably going a bit too far with it, but...
Cool, so then once again though, we can see how this is, I guess, contrasted with, his sister and the portrayal of his sister. So I don't know how to pronounce his sister's name. I don't know if it's Uta, I don't know what it is, but let's just go with one of them. What's the contrast happening here? Like, how is Uta being presented?
So Uta is basically Werner's moral compass. So when he's sort of out there doing all this kind of evil Nazi stuff, he's always going back, imagining her and what she would be thinking of every little thing that he does. So she's also a recurring motif. So I think these two, the idea of the recurring motif of numbers and also the recurring motif of Uta, are great things to compare to each other, because they're sort of these two sides that we get to Werner. On the one side, he is this more machine-like, mathematical, dehumanized and dehumanizing kind of guy, but at the same time he also has this more human side to him, which is when he remembers his sister Yuta and the fact that she would disapprove of what's going on.
And I think it's always interesting, and you see this as a great ad at the moment. Great. There's an ad, I should say. I think it's it might be an NRMA, or it's a car safety ad. And they sort of do it, and they bring out this guy's family, and they ask him before he sees his family, like, 70 people died on the roads, is that acceptable? And he's like, it seems pretty low. And then they bring out 70 members of his family, and all of a sudden he's like, that's way too high. And I think the point is that I think Anthony Doerr is using here is that whenever you see someone and you see them having a family, you see them having a sibling, a brother, a sister, a mother, a father, all of a sudden they become incredibly more humanized. You relate to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you think, I have a sister, I have a brother. What happened? What happened to them? How would I feel? And so I think that's where Jutta plays a really important role in humanizing Werner, particularly as things unfold.
So the quote we've got for that one is Jutta's crestfallen face, and there's this sort of idea of a face that continually is kind of looming over all the terrible stuff that Werner's doing.
Mm-hmm. And then we've got a final example here to start really sort of bringing this sort of paragraph together. I'm probably certainly going to mispronounce more here, but we've got the example here of Etienne revealing to Mary Law.
I would say Mary Law, but I don't
Who knows?
French.
Yeah, neither do I, clearly. And what's Etienne revealing, and why is this important?
Well, so basically, at this point in the novel, they are receiving little coordinates or numbers of some sort inside loaves of bread. And what happens is Mary Law gets the loaf of bread, she brings it to Etienne, they crack it open, they get the numbers, then Etienne broadcasts the numbers on the radio, and the idea is basically so that the Allies are able to sort of use those numbers probably to win the war, find out where tanks are or something to blow them up, that kind of, all that war stuff that I don't really get. So Mary Law and Etienne are having this conversation about these numbers, and what Etienne says is that they're more than numbers, and I think that's a really, really important moment in the novel, because this is a big contrast between Werner, who's saying it's just numbers, pure maths, to Etienne, who acknowledges that these are not just numbers, these are affecting real human beings in real lives. But then the quote that we want to analyse, finally getting to that, is when Mary Law responds saying, "But we are the good guys, aren't we, Uncle?" What technique are we looking at there, first of all?
One, there's a sort of cliche that's emerging in terms of this idea of good guys, and it's something that, we highlighted earlier on at the start of this video in terms of the context and how we sort of tend to view the Nazis as the bad guys and the Allies as the good guys. And I think that the point here is it's really starting to challenge that myth of good and evil in war, because you've got, someone that's supporting the Allies asking themselves the question of, are we the good guys? Because clearly they're recognizing that, well, there's people at the other end of this number. You know, like, we broadcast this, you know, it's potentially, you know, German, French, you know, people that are dying, and that may also have been swept up into this war purely out of their own control.
And I think what's also really important, which is why I've brought this example into this paragraph rather than a different paragraph about Mary Law, is the fact that the existence of Werner himself as a character that we feel empathy for makes this quote even more significant to us as the audience, because as Mary Law is asking the question, we are the good guys, aren't we? We as the audience are thinking, but you're killing people like Werner. You're killing this guy who I've just been reading about and I've come to love.
The sense I get is that just everyone loses.
Everyone loses, and everyone's a victim, basically. And I don't think at any point Anthony Doerr is saying that there's anything good about being a Nazi. Like, he hates what Werner's done, I think, and he hates everything that the Nazis are doing, but beneath all those atrocious acts is an actual human being, and that's what Anthony Doerr was trying to show us.
And I think that's really powerful, because it takes a certain extra level of empathy to be able to do that. You know, to sort of put aside, you know, okay, there's these horrible acts that you know, Werner's committed, but still have empathy for the human that sort of.
And I don't think he ever excuses those acts either, which I think is important. Just as another very quick side note, like, I think that's why the character of Frederick is actually so Frederick is the character who basically stands up to the Nazis and ends up becoming disabled because of that. So Werner did have a choice. He didn't have to do all this terrible stuff, but at the same time, he's still a human. So I think that's
awesome.
Pretty much covers our analysis.
It does. So what do we do with this now, right? So we've now got, and you know, hopefully you can see that there's been a link. We've met our two principles. You know, we've sort of linked you know, the example and the technique to the idea that we're trying to communicate. And then secondly, this idea has grown over time. Like, we've started with this high level idea, and we've shown then specific examples and expanded on it.
So we've started with the idea of, like, the initial empathy we have for him as an orphan. We've moved on to the fact that he sort of does these things that we shouldn't feel like societally we wouldn't be expected to feel empathy for. And then, but we still do because of the way Anthony Doerr has written it. And then finally we move on to the fact that we're sort of confronted with this idea that the hero of the novel, Mary Law, is maybe actually not as perfect as we initially thought. So we've, with each of those 3 points, really built on the previous one.
Now, how do we link this to the common module? I mean, it's great that we've done this, but ultimately, you know, students are going to need to be also
thinking about the syllabus.
Yeah, that's right. So what are some ways in which we could do this?
Yeah, and I think that's really important, right? Because you're probably going to go ahead around now and before your HSC as well and write some paragraphs, write an essay, and then what you're going to need to do in the exam is be able to link those ideas and paragraphs you've written to points of the syllabus.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll just go through a couple of the points of the syllabus and see if we got a question about this, how would we link the paragraph we've just talked out?
So, I mean, the probably immediate one that I think really sort of snaps me in the face is individual versus collective experiences.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we've clearly got some individual experiences that we see, particularly, you know, Werner, and as you know, as a younger child as well, and then we also see the collective experience, particularly as you know he starts getting taken up into the sort of German machine that is.
Yeah, and I guess that idea that sort of what Anthony Doerr was trying to do is see Nazis as individuals rather than this whole like evil collective.
That's right. So rather than painting them all as like the evil brush, it's saying, hey, actually, like, there's this collective and we view them as collectively evil, but, you know, what if we actually dive into the individuals here, all of a sudden it becomes a lot more complex.
Yeah, that's spot on, yeah.
Great, what's another one?
I think paradoxes, anomalies and inconsistencies is a really key dot point there with all the light we cannot see, because obviously, like, Werner is a paradox, he is an anomaly, he's an inconsistency, right? He is simultaneously a Nazi. Like, that's all you need to say, right? Like that's terrible. He's doing terrible stuff. He's part of a terrible system. But at the same time, he is this sort of beautiful young boy who cares so much about
And I'd probably go more to say, and I know that the text doesn't necessarily support this per se, but in my mind, it's less that Werner's an anomaly. I think it's more as a paradox. I think the anomaly would be to say, well, he's the only one like
That's
this,
actually
right?
true. I'd say Frederick, if you're going to talk about anomalies, you probably want to go down the path of Frederick, who stands up against the Nazis. So he's the anomaly.
That's certainly more, that's right.
But he's definitely inconsistent and paradoxical. So those two
that's correct.
things.
Yeah.
That's a good pick up there, thanks.
Awesome. And then one more. What's another one that we could potentially link, what we've just unpacked to the module as well?
I think challenging assumptions, that idea is really big because obviously, hopefully you guys can see already how what this text is doing is very much challenging those assumptions of the myth of good versus evil in World War II.
Awesome. So there we have it, guys. We've just unpacked all the light we cannot see and specific to text human experience. Hopefully you're now going to understand how you take a quote and how you can start to think about the bigger picture ideas that are ultimately coming from the module themselves, and then actually finding your techniques and doing your analysis and linking it. If you have any questions about English generally in the HSC, questions about this text specifically, let us know in the comments. We'd love to help. If there's any way we can help you beyond that in terms of some additional tutoring support for HSC English, don't be shy. Get in touch with us at artofsmart.com.au. If you haven't already, hit subscribe because we'll bring you lots more episodes just like this one, diving into other texts as part of #HSC English Lit Program help.